On the morning of April 13th, 2022, unmarked vehicles rolled through the narrow streets of Cap d'Antibes, that exclusive finger of land jutting into the Mediterranean, where billionaires hide from the world behind stone walls and century-old pines. The convoy stopped at an imposing white mansion that looked almost exactly like the White House in Washington, except this one sat on 17 acres of the most expensive coastal real estate in France. Inside those walls, Roman Abramovich's favorite summer retreat, a property where kings once made love and shipping tycoons once plotted empires, was about to become another casualty of Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. French authorities were here to seize the Château de la Croë, a $120 million palace that had witnessed nearly a century of wealth, scandal, and power. The oligarch, who had spent $40 million restoring this crumbling relic to glory, wouldn't be spending another summer here. What those French officials didn't know as they changed the locks that morning was that this property's story of excess and downfall had actually begun 95 years earlier, when a British newspaper magnate decided he needed a place to escape London's grey skies. The Château came into existence in 1927, the height of the Jazz Age, when the French Riviera was transforming from a winter health retreat into a summer playground for the super-rich. Sir William Pomeroy Burton, who ran Associated Newspapers Limited and had money pouring in from Britain's tabloid wars, commissioned architect Armand Albert Rateau to build him something spectacular on 8 hectares he'd purchased at the tip of Cap d'Antibes. Rateau designed a Victorian colonial masterpiece in brilliant white, with clean lines and classical proportions that made it look like a presidential palace. The original construction cost was never publicly disclosed, but in 1927, money, building on that scale, would have run at minimum £200,000, equivalent to $15 million today. Burton got his 17 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, vast reception halls with 20-foot ceilings, and gardens that cascaded down to a private stretch of Mediterranean coastline. The name La Croix came from the Provençal word for the cross, referencing ancient pathways that once intersected near the site. For a decade, Burton entertained writers, politicians, and fellow press barons at his paradise, serving champagne on terraces overlooking water so blue it didn't look real. But in 1938, as Hitler prepared to devour Europe, Burton decided to lease his palace to the most famous couple in the world, a pair of aristocratic exiles whose love story had nearly destroyed the British monarchy. King Edward VIII had abdicated the British throne in December 1936, after just 326 days as king, all because he refused to give up Wallis Simpson, an American woman who'd been divorced twice. The establishment couldn't stomach a divorced American as Queen of England, so Edward chose love over crown, becoming the Duke of Windsor and walking away from the greatest job in the British Empire. By May 1938, he and Wallis, now the Duchess of Windsor, were searching for a summer home to complement their Paris mansion. When they saw Château de la Croë, Wallis reportedly clapped her hands and said, "This is it." The Duke signed a lease for 3 years at £2,000 annually, about $150,000 in today's money, which was actually a bargain considering the property. The Windsors moved in with mountains of luggage, an army of servants, and Wallis's infamous collection of jewels that included pieces worth millions. She immediately set about redecorating with the same obsessive attention to detail she'd applied to every house she'd ever lived in, spending the Duke's money like she was still furnishing Buckingham Palace. The couple hosted parties, where European aristocrats mixed with American socialites, everyone drinking cocktails and pretending the world wasn't about to explode into war. The Duke, who had disturbing sympathies for Nazi Germany, met with questionable guests during those years, though what was actually said on those Riviera terraces remains murky. What's certain is that when World War II erupted in September 1939, the Windsors were trapped in their French paradise, eventually fleeing to neutral Spain and then to the Bahamas, where Churchill exiled the Duke as governor to keep him away from Hitler. After the war, in 1950, the Château changed hands to a man whose business empire made the newspaper industry look quaint. Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate who would later marry Jackie Kennedy, purchased La Croix at a price never disclosed, but estimated at several £100,000. Onassis was building his tanker fleet and needed a place to entertain business rivals and seduce women away from his wife, Athena Livanos. For 7 years, Onassis used the Château exactly that way, hosting elaborate parties where Greek shipping money mixed with European titles and Hollywood glamour. But his wife eventually caught him in bed at the Château with one of her close friends, a betrayal so blatant that Athena divorced him in 1957. The humiliation forced Onassis to sell, and in an ironic twist, the buyer was his brother-in-law and greatest business rival, Stavros Niarchos. The two Greek tycoons hated each other with a passion that went beyond business, and Niarchos buying Onassis' love nest was the ultimate insult. Niarchos owned La Croë through the 1960s and into the 70s, using it much as Onassis had, for business and pleasure. But by the 1980s, as both men aged and their shipping empires faced new challenges, the chateau passed through several owners whose names never became public. Through the 1980s and 90s, Le Croë fell into shocking decline. The manicured gardens turned into jungle. Squatters broke in and vandalized the interior, ripping out fixtures and defacing walls with graffiti. The roof leaked, windows shattered, and the once glorious rooms filled with mold and decay. By 2001, one of the French Riviera's most historic properties was an abandoned wreck that nobody wanted. That's when Roman Abramovich arrived. Roman Arkadievich Abramovich had been born into poverty in 1966 in Saratov, Soviet Russia, a city on the Volga River known for absolutely nothing. His mother died when he was 18 months old, his father when he was 4, leaving him an orphan raised by relatives. But somewhere in that grim childhood, Abramovich developed an animal cunning for survival and a talent for making money in impossible situations. As the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, he was in his mid-20s, trading plastic toys and other goods, riding the wave of chaos as Russia's communist economy imploded into criminal capitalism. He befriended Boris Berezovsky, one of the original oligarchs who had Kremlin connections and a talent for manipulating the privatization of state assets. In 1995, Berezovsky helped Abramovich acquire a controlling stake in Sibneft, a newly created oil company that the Russian government was selling off for pennies on the dollar. The official price was around $100 million, though some sources say it was closer to $250 million. Either way, it was a rigged auction, an insider deal that violated every principle of fair markets. But in Yeltsin's Russia, that's how fortunes were made. Within a few years, Sibneft was worth billions. Abramovich was suddenly one of the richest men in Russia, with money flowing in from oil exports at a rate of millions per day. He also invested in aluminum, buying into Rusal, and by the early 2000s, his net worth was climbing toward $10 billion. In 1999, Abramovich made the smartest political move of his life. When Vladimir Putin was forming his first cabinet as prime minister, Abramovich interviewed each candidate for cabinet positions before Putin approved them. Think about that for a moment. Your 33-year-old oil tycoon was vetting Putin's government ministers. The two men became close, with Abramovich serving as one of Putin's key oligarch allies. When Putin consolidated power and went after oligarchs who opposed him, Abramovich stayed safe because he'd backed the right horse. He also became governor of Chukotka, a remote region in Russia's Far East, from 2000 to 2008, pumping his own money into infrastructure projects that won him political goodwill. By 2001, Abramovich was searching for properties across Europe where he could park his money and enjoy his wealth. He already owned a 15-bedroom mansion on Kensington Palace Gardens in London, known as Billionaire's Row, which he'd eventually buy for £90 million. He had yachts, private jets, and was about to buy Chelsea Football Club in London for £140 million in 2003, turning the club into a trophy-winning machine by spending over £1 billion on players. But he also wanted a summer retreat on the Mediterranean, somewhere with history and privacy. When he saw Château de la Croë abandoned and vandalized, he saw an opportunity. The purchase price was never disclosed because the property was in such terrible condition, but estimates suggest he paid somewhere between $10 and $20 million, a fraction of its potential value. Then he got to work. Abramovich's renovation of Le Croë from 2001 to 2010 was one of the most expensive private restoration projects ever attempted on the French Riviera. He spent £30 million, about $40 to $47 million, bringing in specialists from across Europe. The work was meticulous. They restored the Victorian facade to its original white brilliance. They rebuilt the interior rooms with period-appropriate details while installing thoroughly modern systems for climate control, security, and communications. The 32,000 square feet of interior space was redesigned to accommodate his growing family. Abramovich had 5 children with his second wife, Irina Malandina, whom he divorced in 2007 in a settlement that cost him over $300 million. In 2008, he married Dasha Zhukova, a Russian-American socialite and art collector, and they would have 2 more children together. The chateau became a family retreat where Abramovich's 7 kids could spend summers away from the spotlight. He added a 15-meter rooftop swimming pool with panoramic Mediterranean views, a modern gym in the basement, and a private cinema with 4,000K projection. The gardens were completely replanted, with landscape architects recreating the original 1920s design. He built a 400-square-meter ecological pool fed by a waterfall and surrounded by water lilies, a naturalistic alternative to the rooftop lap pool. The security systems were state-of-the-art, with cameras, sensors, and a team of guards monitoring the perimeter 24 hours a day. Staff quarters for 6 full-time employees were renovated to luxury standards because Abramovich treated his people well, paying top salaries to ensure loyalty and discretion. In 2010, Abramovich held a small lecture at the property where he showed a short film about the restoration, one of the few times he ever publicly discussed the chateau. The film showed before and after images that were shocking. Rooms that had been covered in graffiti were now elegant spaces with period furniture and original art. Gardens that had been overgrown jungle were now manicured perfection. The project was a triumph, and the property's estimated value soared to over 100 million euros. The monthly operating costs for Château de la Croë during Abramovich's ownership were staggering. The electricity bill alone was estimated at £47,000 per month. When the property was in full use during summer, about $60,000. Because running air conditioning in a 32,000 square foot mansion in Mediterranean heat, while also powering a rooftop pool, cinema, gym, and multiple kitchens requires industrial level power. The staff salaries for 6 full-time employees, plus seasonal workers for major events, ran at least £30,000 monthly. Groundskeepers maintained 17 acres of gardens that required constant irrigation, pruning, and replanting to stay perfect. Security personnel rotated in shifts, monitoring cameras and patrolling the grounds. Property taxes were another major expense, though Abramovich's lawyers worked hard to keep those down by undervaluing the estate. In 2018, French tax authorities launched an investigation when they realized Abramovich had declared the property's value far below its actual worth. The Bloomberg News Agency reported that tax officials valued the chateau at approximately 47,000 euros per square meter, which would put the total value at 100 million euros or more. Abramovich's team had apparently declared it at a much lower figure to reduce annual property taxes, which in France can be substantial for ultra-luxury homes. The investigation revealed the complex offshore ownership structure Abramovich used to hold the property. It was owned through a series of companies ultimately controlled by Millhouse Capital, his UK-based holding firm. That corporate veil made it difficult for French authorities to even confirm Abramovich was the beneficial owner until they dug through layers of paperwork. All of this financial maneuvering was perfectly legal under French and international law, just highly aggressive tax planning that rich people employ to keep as much money as possible. But it created a paper trail that French authorities would remember 4 years later when they needed to seize the property. During those 2 decades of ownership from 2001 to 2022, Abramovich used Château de la Croë primarily as a private family escape. Unlike some oligarchs who threw massive parties and filled their homes with politicians and celebrities, Abramovich was relatively low-key at La Croë. He'd arrive by private jet at Nice-Côte d'Azur Airport, about 30 minutes from Cap d'Antibes, and his security team would drive him to the chateau in vehicles with tinted windows. Dasha Zhukova and their 2 children, Aaron Alexander, born in 2009, and Leah Lou, born in 2013, would spend weeks there each summer. Abramovich's 5 older children from his previous marriage also visited. The family swam in the rooftop pool, walked the gardens, and enjoyed dinners on terraces overlooking the sea. Occasionally, Abramovich entertained business associates, but there were no reports of wild parties or suspicious activities. His neighbors on Cap d'Antibes, a tight-lipped community of ultra-wealthy residents who value privacy above all else, barely noticed his presence. The neighborhood included other Russian oligarchs, European aristocrats, and American tech billionaires, all living behind walls in estates worth tens or hundreds of millions. Abramovich fit right in. The most exciting thing that happened during his ownership might have been his divorce from Dasha Zhukova in 2017, which was announced as amicable after 10 years of marriage. Zhukova went on to marry Stavros Niarchos III, the grandson of the Stavros Niarchos who'd owned La Croë in the 1960s and 70s. That connection created a strange historical loop, with Zhukova now part of the Niarchos family that once owned the chateau where she'd spent summers with her first husband. But while Abramovich was enjoying his Mediterranean paradise, storm clouds were gathering around Putin's Russia. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 had triggered the first wave of Western sanctions against Russian oligarchs close to Putin. Abramovich had mostly avoided those initial sanctions because he'd obtained Israeli citizenship and lived partly in the UK, where he was famous for owning Chelsea Football Club. He was seen as more of a Western-oriented businessman than a Kremlin apparatchik. But in February 2022, when Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the calculation changed. Western governments decided that all oligarchs close to Putin, regardless of where they lived or what passports they held, would be targeted. The goal was to economically isolate Putin's inner circle and pressure them to abandon their support for the war. On March 10, 2022, the UK government announced sanctions against 7 Russian oligarchs, and Roman Abramovich was at the top of the list. The official designation called him a pro-Kremlin oligarch and cited his net worth as £9.4 billion. The sanctions froze all his UK assets, imposed a travel ban, and prohibited any British person or company from doing business with him. Abramovich immediately announced he was trying to sell Chelsea Football Club, but the UK government said the sale couldn't proceed under normal circumstances because he'd be prohibited from receiving the proceeds. A special license was eventually issued allowing the sale to go forward, but only if Abramovich pledged the proceeds to victims of the Ukraine war. In May 2022, an American consortium led by Todd Boehly bought Chelsea for £4.25 billion, but that money went straight into a frozen UK bank account where it remains as of 2026. On April 12, 2022, exactly 33 days after the UK sanctions, the Royal Court of Jersey dropped a bomb. Jersey, one of the Channel Islands between England and France, is a notorious tax haven where wealthy individuals park assets in offshore trusts. The court announced it was freezing more than $7 billion in assets held in Jersey trusts suspected of being connected to Abramovich. $7 billion? That single asset freeze represented roughly half of Abramovich's estimated wealth at that time. The Jersey authorities wouldn't specify exactly what assets were frozen, but financial experts believed they included investments, real estate holdings, and corporate stakes held through Millhouse Capital and other vehicles. The sheer scale of the freeze made headlines around the world. It was the largest asset freeze in Jersey's history, and it revealed just how much money Abramovich had hidden away in offshore structures. Abramovich's lawyers immediately launched legal challenges, arguing the freeze was improper and that the trusts were not directly owned by him. But the Jersey courts rejected those arguments, saying there was sufficient evidence connecting Abramovich to the trusts. Those legal battles are still ongoing as of 2026, with Swiss courts now cooperating in investigations into how Abramovich originally made his fortune through the Sibneft sale back in 2005. The very next day, April 13, 2022, French authorities executed their own coordinated strike. France's finance ministry announced it was freezing 31 luxury properties owned by 8 sanctioned Russian billionaires with a combined value of nearly $620 million. 12 of those properties belonged to Abramovich. The list included the Château de la Croë, valued by French authorities at $120 million. French police and tax officials arrived at Cap d'Antibes, secured the property, changed the locks, and posted notices declaring it frozen under EU sanctions. The seizure was first reported by Le Parisien newspaper, which described the chateau's illustrious history and its current owner's predicament. Under French law, an asset freeze means the owner cannot sell, transfer, rent, or use the property. It remains their legal property, but they have zero access. The French government becomes the de facto custodian, responsible for maintaining the property and preventing deterioration. If the sanctions are ever lifted, the property returns to the owner. If the owner is eventually convicted of crimes, the property can be forfeited to the state and sold, with proceeds going to the French treasury or to victims of the crimes. But as of early 2026, the Château de la Croë remains in legal limbo, frozen but not forfeited, maintained but not occupied. The seizure of La Croix symbolized the reach of Western sanctions in ways that even the Chelsea sale didn't, because the football club was a business asset with employees and fans and a public face. The chateau was purely personal, a family home filled with memories of summer vacations and children's laughter. When the locks were changed, Abramovich's family could no longer return to a place where they'd spent some of their happiest times. His younger children, who'd grown up swimming in that rooftop pool and playing in those gardens, were suddenly barred from their own home. Abramovich himself couldn't protest publicly because doing so would only draw more attention to his assets and make him more of a target. He'd moved to Turkey and Israel after the UK sanctions, living between Istanbul and Tel Aviv, unable to return to London where he'd spent 2 decades. He no longer attended Chelsea matches, no longer walked the streets of Kensington, and no longer spent summers at Cap d'Antibes. The life he'd built with his oil billions, a life of luxury properties across Europe and acceptance in Western society, had collapsed in less than 2 months. And the worst part was that the frozen assets weren't just the properties themselves, but also all the memories and experiences attached to them. What makes the Château de la Croë story particularly striking is how it connects to a broader history of wealth, power, and downfall that stretches back a century. In 1938, King Edward VIII lost his throne for love and ended up leasing this property as a consolation prize, spending the rest of his life as an exiled aristocrat bitter about what he'd sacrificed. In 1957, Aristotle Onassis lost the property in a humiliating divorce after his wife caught him cheating, a scandal that exposed his infidelities to the world. In 2022, Roman Abramovich lost the property to international sanctions because of his association with Vladimir Putin, watching his Western life unravel as payment for decades of loyalty to the Russian president. The chateau itself has remained constant through all of it, a white mansion on Mediterranean cliffs, beautiful and impassive, passing from one wealthy man's hands to another's, each one convinced he was powerful enough to hold on to paradise forever. The property as history teaches an uncomfortable lesson about the limits of money and the fragility of wealth built on questionable foundations. Edward built his life on royal privilege and threw it away for a woman the establishment hated. Onassis built his fortune on shipping and lost his home through sexual arrogance. Abramovich built his billions on Russian oil acquired through rigged privatization and lost his properties when geopolitics turned against his patron. None of them could ultimately protect what they owned because their wealth came with strings attached, with obligations to power structures larger than themselves. As of January 2026, nearly 4 years after the seizure, the Château de la Croë remains frozen. The French government has maintained the property, keeping the gardens somewhat tended and the buildings secure, but it's not clear who's paying those maintenance costs. Presumably, funds from Abramovich's other frozen assets are being used, or the French state is covering expenses with the expectation of eventual reimbursement. There are no reports of damage or deterioration, which suggests the property is being looked after reasonably well. But it's also not being lived in, which means this 32,000 square foot mansion sits empty month after month, year after year, a ghost house on one of the most valuable pieces of coastal land in the world. Locals in Cap d'Antibes occasionally walk past the gates and wonder what will happen to it. Some hope the French government will eventually sell it and use the proceeds to help Ukrainian refugees, turning Abramovich's summer palace into humanitarian aid. Others think the property will remain frozen indefinitely, caught in legal battles that could drag on for a decade or more. Abramovich's lawyers have been fighting the sanctions in multiple jurisdictions, arguing that he shouldn't be punished for Putin's actions, and that he's actually tried to help negotiate peace between Russia and Ukraine. In March 2022, Abramovich was involved in early peace talks between Russian and Ukrainian delegations, reportedly at Ukraine's request, though those negotiations went nowhere. Some have speculated that his willingness to help was partly motivated by a desire to get sanctions lifted, though Abramovich's representatives insist his motives were humanitarian. Regardless of the motives, the sanctions remain in place, and the chateau remains frozen. The cultural impact of the Château de la Croë story extends beyond one oligarch's downfall. It's become a symbol of how Western sanctions target Russian wealth, and how the war in Ukraine triggered the largest asset freezes in history. France alone has seized or frozen nearly 1 billion euros from Russian oligarchs since February 2022, according to government figures released in January 2026. Across the European Union, the total is over 200 billion euros. The UK has frozen about 24 billion pounds. The United States has frozen tens of billions more. And much of that money belongs to a relatively small group of oligarchs who built their fortunes in the 1990s and 2000s through Russia's chaotic privatization process. The Château de la Croë is just one property among hundreds that have been seized, but it's become emblematic because of its history and its value. When you freeze a $120 million chateau that once belonged to a king and a shipping magnate, you're making a statement about the reach of the law and the limits of power. The message is that no matter how rich you are, no matter how many offshore companies you hide behind, Western governments can still take everything if you're on the wrong side of geopolitics. But there's also a counter-narrative that some legal experts have raised. They question whether it's right to seize private property from individuals who have not been convicted of any crimes. Abramovich has never been charged with corruption, money laundering, or any criminal offense. The sanctions against him are administrative, based on his alleged ties to Putin and his role in Russia's economy. In the UK sanctions designation, the government cited his relationship with Putin, his governorship of Château, and his sale of Sibneft to Gazprom as evidence of his connection to the Kremlin. But none of that is illegal. Selling a company to a state-owned firm and serving as a regional governor are perfectly legal activities. The accusation is essentially guilt by association, the idea that by being close to Putin and benefiting from Russia's political system, Abramovich has enabled Putin's war. That's a political judgment, not a legal one. Some civil liberties advocates worry that sanctions without criminal charges set a dangerous precedent, allowing governments to seize assets based on political considerations rather than proven wrongdoing. On the other hand, supporters of the sanctions argue that this is exactly what sanctions are meant to do: pressure individuals close to adversarial governments without needing to prove criminal conduct in court. It's economic warfare, not law enforcement. The debate continues, but in the meantime, the Château de la Croë sits empty. What's fascinating is how the property itself has remained largely unchanged through all these transitions of power. The walls still stand white against the Mediterranean blue. The gardens, if maintained, still descend in terraces toward the sea. The rooftop pool, if filled, still reflects the sky. The architecture that Armand Albert Rateau designed in 1927 has survived the Duke of Windsor, Aristotle Onassis, Stavros Niarchos, decades of abandonment, Roman Abramovich's restoration, and now a government seizure. The building doesn't care who owns it or why they lost it. It simply exists, beautiful and indifferent, waiting for the next chapter. And that's perhaps the most profound lesson of the Château de la Croë. Wealth is temporary, power is fragile, And even the most magnificent properties are ultimately just stages where human dramas play out, before the actors move on and new ones take the stage. Roman Abramovich will not be the last owner of this chateau. Eventually, sanctions will be lifted or modified, legal battles will be resolved, and the property will change hands again. Maybe it will be sold at auction to another billionaire who wants a Mediterranean palace. Maybe it will be forfeited to the French state and turned into a museum about the oligarch era. Maybe it will be returned to Abramovich or his heirs in some future settlement. Whatever happens, the chateau will endure, and its story will add another chapter to a history that already spans a century of excess, scandal, and downfall. For now, on a quiet morning in Cap d'Antibes in January 2026, if you walk past the gates of Château de la Croë, you'll see nothing but the white facade and the closed entrance, the gardens beyond the walls, the sky above. No lights in the windows, no sounds from inside. The rooftop pool sits empty or covered for winter. The cinema screens no films. The gym equipment sits unused. 7 children who once played here have gone on with their lives elsewhere. And somewhere, whether in Istanbul or Tel Aviv or on a yacht in international waters, Roman Abramovich lives with the knowledge that he spent $40 million restoring a paradise he can never return to. All because he tied his fortune to a Russian president who decided to invade a neighboring country. The Château de la Croë has seen kings lose crowns, shipping magnates lose marriages, and an oligarch lose his foothold in the West. The property's real value was never the $120 million the French government assigned to it, but rather the lesson it teaches about how quickly wealth built on questionable foundations can crumble when geopolitics shifts. That lesson, like the chateau itself, will outlast all its temporary owners,